Hello, my name is Heidi Nibouar, and I'm going to talk with you today about some experiments that we've done in scaled planning environment. So to set the scene a little bit, all of this took place at NWEA, which is an education nonprofit. In the engineering department at NWEA, there were 19 Scrum teams, and they were distributed across 4 value streams. So there was a large need for dependency management and visibility into the work ahead at more of the program or team of teams level, as opposed to the individual Scrum team level. So in order to manage all of this, we implemented a scaled Agile planning framework, and we had done this about 3 years previously. And this framework was really based on a 3-month plan and having that sync the teams. So essentially every quarter, the beginning of the quarter, we would get together, we'd plan out the next 3 months, all 19 teams would. They'd identify dependencies across teams, talk about any risks, give visibility to our stakeholders, and then go about and deliver on those 3 months and meet again the next quarter. Now that planning framework sat alongside an end-to-end workflow, so from idea and concept to getting a product into our customers' hands, that looked a little bit like this. The folks like product management, architects, UX would define the problems, identify the market gaps, etc., explore any solutions that could meet those problems, do some designs, get into detailed requirements, and they would have all this done in time for this quarterly planning event that I mentioned. And then the dev teams or the Scrum teams would take all of that, take those stories and plot them across the next 3 months. Now you may be thinking right now, that doesn't really sound very agile, does it? And I would completely agree with you, as would the organization. We realized that something needed to change. And so we established a new workflow. We didn't want to change everything, so we kept that planning event, but we established a new workflow and called it the product value workflow. The goals of which were to do a few things: increase iteration based on feedback. When everything is really defined up front and then handed off, there's no ability to iterate once the Scrum team builds something and tests it and tries it against users. We wanted to make sure there was more ownership by the Scrum team, so we pulled the developers up into that initial phase. They got to help define the problems and the solutions to those problems. And create the design. And then we also did this to increase the frequency of delivering value. So where did the problem come in? As we implemented this new product value workflow, we kind of took note of something interesting. There were 2 distinct types of efforts that sort of made their way through that workflow. One was known work. This kind of work is the scope is pretty well known, the technology has probably been tried and true. There's a high level of predictability. So even though it might be fairly complicated, there might be a lot of moving pieces, they're pieces that you can predict and piece together and plan those dependencies and coordinate them up front. This type of work that was really known aligned very well with our scaled planning process, right? You can get to that quarterly event and plot things out and align your dependencies really nicely. The other type of work to go through the product value workflow was less known work, fairly unknown. This is the kind of work where as you dig into the problem emerges, it changes, you learn more. You probably are getting feedback from users along the way. You need that in order to move towards your solution. You might be using new technologies or testing new tools. And this kind of work is extremely difficult to plan in 3-month chunks. And so these people would get to that quarterly planning session and struggle. The planning and the workflow conflicted inherently. And let's be honest, it's not like this was a new problem. It's not like previously with our old workflow, we could actually predict the unknown. It's just that the product value workflow and the adherence to these new principles really shone the spotlight on the fact that this type of work had issues with scaled planning. So we tried to figure out sort of what were the symptoms, what manifested because of these issues. So we had a lot of conversations. We had a lot of retros. We interviewed a lot of folks one-on-one. We did many surveys, and we came up with three main problem areas. Number one is that, especially in this area of unknown work, the morale was very low. Teams felt really forced to commit to a 3-month plan without knowing what the work was ahead. Sometimes they had a general sense of what product management wanted, like what the scope was-ish, but they might not know the technology at all. Sometimes they didn't even know the scope of the work, yet they felt really forced to commit to something because we all came together and created these plans. And so often it led to sort of loose plans with then heroic efforts at the end to meet commitments. Sometimes it led to not meeting the needs of the user because they didn't have the ability to dig in and explore and then change. So they really felt forced to commit to these plans. They also felt, the Scrum teams felt like they were the ones who kind of held the brunt of the weight because they were the ones who had to create these 3-month plans. The upfront folks didn't, and there was less upfront now, right? We took away that real big gating factor between upfront and downstream. It was more of a team, but still product management, design, architects, nobody else was responsible for creating their own plan. And so the Scrum team always felt like they were sort of the ones who were left holding the flag when issues arose. Number two, it ended in a worse user experience because, like I mentioned before, in this type of work, you really need that user feedback in order to figure out where you're going. And there wasn't the ability to do that when you're creating a 3-month plan. And they ended up missing milestones. A lot of the times it was because there were dependencies that were missed. So if team A went in with some known work and they could figure out exactly what they were doing during the course of the next 3 months, and team B had unknown work, well, halfway through that 3-month period, team B might realize that they had a dependency on team A, but that team was booked up for the 3 months. They had to wait until the next quarter to fit it in. So this led to not delivering on our commitments. So what do we do about it? As with anything, when you experience problems, the best thing is to pull in the people who are experiencing the problems to try and come up with a solution. This is not an area where we could have a top-down management's going to fix everything. So I led a workshop with 12 team members from 5 different areas, including development, product management, user experience, and a couple of other areas. And we, first of all, started out creating our vision. So that step 1, that envision the mountain up at the top there. We decided to first make sure we were all on the same page, right? We needed to make sure that we were all aligned as to whether we were climbing Kilimanjaro or Everest. The goal needed to be the same amongst all of us. And then we came back to where we are now and said, cool, based on where we want to be, what gaps are there that we're seeing? What is our current state? And then we started planning. What can we do? What are possible solutions to get us further towards our goal? And how do we want to chart that course? Which ones do we want to do first? What are the immediate action items? And where that landed us was with a proposal that we ultimately called the increment check-in. And with this proposal, we took that 3-month planning increment. And for this area, we chose a specific area to start with. We decided to boil it down to 1 month instead of 3. And we decided to focus on just one effort at a time. We call them initiatives. They're essentially gigantic epics. And we decided to integrate all of the team members. So instead of having this planning event for the Scrum teams, it was a planning event for everybody who is involved in that life cycle. And we said, let's try it out with just one Scrum team and one initiative and see what happens. The agenda for the workshop for the monthly meeting looked a little bit like this. Business and product would start with the context. So one challenge that dev teams have always had at our organization is that they don't always have all the context on the strategy or the market or etc. So we always started with that in case anything changed, there was anything new. Then product, research, design, architecture would talk through what they completed in the last 4 weeks and what they're planning to do. This included things like user feedback and impact from things that they'd heard. And oftentimes this wasn't new to the dev team or to others in attendance, but in case people hadn't heard it, this was a time for everybody to catch up and to check in with each other. And the delivery or Scrum team would say what they completed and what was planned, and it'd have a quick retro on how the last month went. So this was our proposal that we took to leadership and to the stakeholders in this area. And there were concerns. There are always concerns when there's change and there's something new, right? One of the biggest concerns was from our stakeholders who were afraid that they have had this 3-month plan that they've always relied on, and they've been able to change their work based on what was expected to come in the upcoming 3 months. And they didn't want that to go down to 1 month. They liked having that horizon. However, it wasn't always really a high confidence horizon, right? Because things did change. We didn't know a lot at the beginning of the 3 months. So even though it wasn't a high fidelity plan, it felt good to have at least something that they could count on. So they didn't want to boil that down to 1 month. So there was a lot of education there. There were also just other sort of logistical questions that arose. And so we tried to start combating the anxieties, and we said, you know what, we're just going to get started. We're going to try it and we're going to see how it goes. But because there were many concerns, we realized that we really needed to be keeping a pulse on how it was going and be able to quantify along the way how this was working for people so that we could change where needed. So after every monthly session, a few of us from different areas, about 5 of us, would get together and we'd look at how the event itself went. And we would give a survey to everybody who was there and say, you know, what did you think of this part of the event, this part, which parts provided value for you, which parts didn't. And after every single monthly event, we would tweak it. We would tweak the audience. We would tweak the agenda. We would tweak the artifacts that we reviewed. We tweak it until that area gained more value for everybody. But what happened? After 6 months of doing this increment check-in, we did a poll among everybody involved, from the dev team members to the architects and product managers to the customers and stakeholders who attended. And the poll revealed that, first off, 70% of dev team members felt less pressure to commit to unknown work. And that increased morale significantly. The employee engagement score, which is like a net promoter score that was run at that same time period for that specific area, the value stream where this took place, rose from -16% to 60%. It was a ginormous gain that we had never seen the likes of before. And there were other factors. You know, this was just one team out of the 4 that were in that value stream, but this was a large piece of it. And this is sort of a smaller example of what was happening on the larger level in that value stream. Team members reported that they were able to change direction more often based on direct feedback. Prior to this change, we had instances where people got to the end of that 3-month period and delivered something, and it couldn't even be released because this MVP didn't meet the user's needs because there was no ability to vet anything and change the plan. That never happened again. There were 0 instances of not being able to deploy an MVP because it wasn't even minimal viable. Team members saw an increased ability to inspect and adapt the processes because they were meeting once a month now, not every 3 months, and they were constantly focused on retroing what was working and what wasn't. They saw an improvement in collaboration between upstream and downstream. They saw each other more as a unit instead of 2 distinct separate groups. And 6 months in, a second team was added to the check-in. And from that point forward, there were no more deliverables missed to unidentified dependencies, which, remember, was one of the big problem areas that we saw. So these were sort of the numbers that came halfway through, and we realized we're on the right track here. So in conclusion, when we tried to blend our fairly rigid planning process with our new, more iterative, fluid workflow, we found some issues, especially with certain types of work. So in order to address this, we pulled in the team members impacted, and we began to iterate, put together a proposal and iterate on a solution. Over time, those changes have led to increased collaboration. They've led to the increased ability to pivot, higher quality deployments, and overall higher morale across team members. Thank you for watching this today. I hope it was helpful.